When fascism wins power, it no longer needs to hide its real face, and in fact it finds it useful to legitimise its rule with a so-called doctrine. This doctrine, to be sure, was not elaborated for the first time after the conquest of power. Long before that it could be found in the writings and speeches of the leaders, though submerged in so-called anti-capitalist phraseology. When fascism wins power, demagogy retires to the background, yielding the spotlight to ideological justification for the dictatorship. And at last, we then see clearly that fascist doctrine is an old acquaintance. It is a twin of reactionary philosophy, the philosophy of feudalism, of absolutism. This was precisely the philosophy that the bourgeoisie had to combat so bitterly at the dawn of its rule in order to achieve its own liberation. But the day came when the bourgeoisie perceived, quote, that all the weapons which it had forged against feudalism turned their points against itself, and that all the means of education which it had produced rebelled against its own civilization, that all the gods which it had created had fallen away from it, end quote. When it understood that, quote, all the so-called bourgeois liberties and organs of progress attacked and menaced its class rule, end quote. Shaken to its foundations by the crisis of capitalism, able to save its threatened profits only by destroying democratic institutions and brutally exterminating the proletarian organisations, the bourgeoisie rejects the ideology that once helped it triumph over absolutism. Indeed, it dresses itself up in the ideology of that self-same absolutism. It denies progress, attacks reason, refuses the masses the right of self-government, tramples on democracy, invokes the so-called aristocratic principle and reasons of state, rehabilitates violence. There is nothing astonishing about finding reactionary thinkers who attacked with hatred the idea of the French Revolution, democracy and liberalism suddenly becoming great men. From these masters of counter-revolution, fascism borrows its doctrines. Quote, we represent the antithesis of all that world of the immoral principles of 1789, end quote. A reaction against the, quote, movement of the 18th century visionaries and encyclopedists, exclaimed the Italian fascists. And the National Socialists say, quote, the year 1789 will be erased from history. We wish to destroy the immoral ideology of the French Revolution, end quote. The bourgeoisie used the idea of progress to batter down the bastions of absolutism. Antiquity and the Middle Ages lived on the idea of the corruption and decadence of the human race, on the dogma of the fall of man. Humanity, come perfect from the hands of God, was through original sin plunged into evil. Man is born wicked and is not perfectible, and similarly his political, economic and social system. Man must accept it as imposed by God, without discussion and without hope of improvement. To this pessimistic doctrine, so convenient for the justification of tyranny and the legitimisation of poverty, the bourgeoisie, eager to be freed, opposed the idea of infinite progress at the beginning of its domination. The golden age is not in the past but before us. Humanity is perfectible and is continually rising from poverty to material well-being, from ignorance to knowledge, from barbarism to civilization. The great discoveries of the second half of the 18th century, the birth of the machine age and modern industry, gave new confirmation to the idea of progress. The young industrial bourgeoisie was sure the new means of production invented by it were capable of infinitely improving the lot of humanity. From this came the blissful optimism of the Saint-Simonian businessmen like Michel Chevalier. But a day comes when the idea of progress is turned against the bourgeoisie. The productive forces, as they develop at a dizzy rate of speed, come into conflict with the social system. Capitalist society ceases to be progressive, and far from holding out to humanity a prospect of well-being, it offers only poverty and unemployment. Then suddenly the bourgeoisie stops believing in progress. The opponents of progress become its ideological masters. Italian fascism vulgarizes the anti-progressive diatribes of George Sorel, a combination syndicalist theoretician and reactionary philosopher. That original and ambivalent essayist wrote a whole book to denounce the illusions of progress. To be sure, what he hated in the idea of progress was above all its facility. He wanted man to fight and not passively wait for happiness on earth. But under the surface, he denied progress itself. In 1913, he confided to a friend, quote, "Progress is only an illusion. The idea of progress is a naive idea belied by the history of humanity." End quote. Mussolini, who proclaims himself a disciple of Sorel, similarly rejects the idea of progress. Quote, "Fascism rejects the myth of happiness and infinite progress. It does not believe in the possibility of so-called happiness on earth, advanced in the literature of the 18th century economists." End quote. Hence, he condemns so-called teleological conceptions, according to which, at a certain moment of history, the human race will achieve the final stage of organisation. Another weapon of the conquering bourgeoisie was reason. For revealed knowledge it substituted the free exercise of intelligence, the supremacy of common sense. But today that weapon is being turned against it. The employment of reason and scientific analysis can no longer serve except to undermine the foundations of its rule and condemn the capitalist system of production. Only a resorting to the irrational can permit it to prolong its reign. Let man renounce domination of the world and subject himself to it as to a mystical phenomenon. The expression is from Edward Berth, another of Sorel's disciples. Let his intelligence be ready to abdicate before all the instinctive forces and be carried away by any movement whatever. Let him be ready to follow the first charlatan who comes along, the first maker of miracles or myths. Let him be ready to trust, not to reasoned actions, but to blind faith in a Duce or Führer, in seeking a way out from his sufferings. If you want to read more on this subject, then I recommend reading Fascism and Big Business by Daniel Guerin, which is available for free online on the Libcom website. I would also recommend reading Roger Griffin on this subject as well. Thank you for listening, everyone. All the best.